Hey, welcome back to a special edition of Manager Mailbag. We've got Brennan here and Nicole. We're going to answer some questions from a webinar we just ran that we didn't have time to answer on the webinar. So these are real anonymous questions from real managers who showed up to one of our webinars, and you just get to hear the answers now.
Yeah, just a little Q&A. So the first question that we received and we didn't get to in the webinar is, how do you create a culture of teaching / learning / mentoring when most engineers are introverts and just want to focus on their own work?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question that I've talked to a lot of different engineering managers about. I think the first thing to think about is there's maybe differences on this person's team than, the broader population of engineers. So I'll caveat this by saying I'm going to talk to more the broader population of engineers than this individual. The first thing is, I don't know if it's necessarily true that most engineers are introverts. I think a lot are. I think a lot aren't. And if you go and do a quick Google search for that, you'll find that, about half think they're a little bit more extroverted and about half think they're a little bit more introverted. I think what happens is we perceive engineers to be more introverted because the type of work that they do is often more focused, individual, headphones on, keyboard. There's a lot of stuff that has to be loaded up into your brain in order to do a computer science task. And that is unlikely to be done, in a meeting room with 5 other people, or unlikely to be done while you're playing ping pong or something. So I think in order for engineers to do work, they tend to be striving for more quiet time, focused time to get that work done. And I think sometimes the perception is that they're introverted because of that. They need more focused time to get their work done. So some of the things that we do is we push for a no meeting Wednesday. That gives every engineer a ton of focus time on Wednesdays. We try to limit meetings on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and if we have them, what we do is we put them either at the start of the day or the end of the day. That just gives big gaps for focus time or deep work time. On our team, we do have some coaching, learning, mentoring processes that we put in place. There's buddy systems when there's a new person being onboarded. So a junior will be paired with someone who's more senior. They help out with some of the technical things, especially with code reviews. And then all the way to we have our front side meeting. We have our front end team and our back end team who have their own respective meetings. I think they meet about once a month, but throughout the month they add to the agenda things they've learned about our code base or learned about the technology in general. And then once a month on a Monday they'll meet up, or a Tuesday I think they'll meet up and just go through it all, right? Hey, here's kind of their accumulated learnings, and they can kind of self-mentor each other. The other thing I'll say to my team all the time is, communication is part of your job, right? So sure, you're paid to come in and do the work, ship the code, whatever, but part of your job is to communicate. And so as much as sometimes those things can be frustrating or feel like they're distracting, it's part of everyone's job.
Okay, next question. How do you improve connectivity and team cohesiveness when one engineering team member is fully remote, but the majority of the team is on site together? So it's essentially a hybrid team, but only one person is not in person.
How do you cater to them? It's so tough. I think hybrid's tough because the first thing you have to think about is what flavor of hybrid is your team or is your organization, right? In this case, it sounds sort of like that this person's flavor of hybrid is that, everyone's on site all the time except for one person who's all the time off site. There's others that where hybrid means we're all going into the office 2 days a week. There's other hybrids that, everyone can choose what days to go into the office. I think depending on the flavor, you're going to have to choose somewhat of a gravity. Where's the center of gravity on your team? Are you, is the center of gravity more remote work, or is the center of gravity more in-office work? I think it's okay to say, hey, the center of gravity is in office. I think that's fine. It seems like people are somewhat scared to say that, and they just say hybrid instead. And I think that causes a little bit of confusion. But in this particular case, I feel like the center of gravity is in office, and there's one person who's remote who's probably just not coming into the office maybe ever. So how do you bring the connectivity of that person in? I think what you want to do is bring the smaller number towards the gravity. So how do you make this remote person brought more into in-person meetings, right? More into the in-person team environment versus taking the majority of people who are in office and trying to force them to be more remote while they're at work. So I would look at something like that. I think certainly the best case scenario for this remote person is if you actually do run all of your meetings like they're remote meetings. But I don't think that there's that much of a difference between a great remote meeting and just a great meeting in general, besides maybe some of the tools and tech. But to bring that remote person in, I would look at something like Owl Labs has a meeting owl. It's just a really good microphone, and it's a really good speaker system, and it's a really good camera for the room. You get a good 360 camera of it. And I would also maybe ask or look at the tech setup that the remote employee has. Do they have a good camera where you can kind of see the body language? Do they have good lighting where, they're lit? Do they have the camera on, etc.? I think that will help the other people include that person in the conversation a lot more if they can see their face and see if they wince at certain things. The other things I would sort of recommend outside of that is just true for in-person or remote meetings alike. Like, I think if you really want to improve the cohesiveness, I would do make sure you're sharing the agenda in advance, right? Make sure you're documenting the decisions that you're talking about. Make sure that, there's these opportunities set up for the remote person to maybe contribute. I would maybe, if the person's a good note taker and they're comfortable with it, I would maybe say like, hey, do you want to be the note taker? And then you as the manager be the moderator of the meeting. And so that alleviates some of your stress of taking notes, puts it on someone who has a keyboard handy, but then you're able to turn on your eyes and ears to say, well, that person hasn't talked a lot. Let's go to them or whatever, and direct the attention in the meeting, back to the remote attendee.
Yeah. Even though difficult, like, it's going to force you to do those best practices of taking notes and really documenting everything that you're talking about.
Yeah, the one thing I'd be super cautious of, and it's just hard when everyone's in the office except for one person, is like, make sure you try to not do as many ad hoc meetings. It's not uncommon that sole person will be left out. Like, you might just forget to make a calendar invite. You all jump into a room and you forget to set up all the video conferencing for that one remote person. So try to think about what are the natural connection points your team needs and set that up in a recurring way. So, it's automatic for the remote person to join in and be on time and all that stuff. And if you are doing things like you're doing, like going out for a coffee, if the person's comfortable with a FaceTime, it might be fun just to FaceTime them partway through and include them in some of that as well.
Okay, third question. Similar, but a little bit different. How do we be more inclusive of introverts? So also on the topic of introverts, especially in the current remote environment.
I've talked about, are they always introverts? But what if they are introverts, right? What do you do? The first thing going through my head is I actually think remote is pretty good for introverts, right? I would also think about in the current remote environment, like how to be more inclusive with extroverts who are like, locked inside their house, they're dying and they want to, go and meet people and gain some energy that way. So I think that just boils down to know the styles of your team. And truthfully, there's more than just two styles, introverts and extroverts. It's a spectrum of a whole bunch of things. So I would dig into that. Like, what is everyone's preference? Do they have preferences for communications, for meetings, for times, for when they're, most able to talk and think and share? There's an exercise you could go through yourself as a manager called a manager readme, where you write down all of those norms of yourself. Are you okay with being emailed or slacked at 8 p.m.? Does that stress you out, or are you actually fine with it? If you Slack someone at 8 p.m., what does that mean? Should people be stressed out? You can kind of document some of that stuff about yourself, share that with your team, and maybe ask them to do the same thing. And that at least gives you something to look at and say, like, all right, this is this person's preferred method and this is this person's preferred method. Maybe we can set up some things, to get people into their comfort zone faster. So I would try with that. The thing I would think about in the meeting context itself. So if you're running a meeting, I would think about the two types of folks who are typically more quiet, maybe sometimes pegged as the introverts in meetings. One would be the people who are just shy, right? They just don't necessarily want to speak in front of a crowd. And the other people are maybe not necessarily shy. They just like to think about their answers before speaking. And so as they're absorbing new information in the meeting, they might be uncomfortable sharing their opinion on it in that moment. It might take them a little bit longer. to form that opinion in a way that they're comfortable speaking. So I would think about for those people, you're going to want to do the basics really well. You're going to want to make sure that like the agenda is shared in advance, the information shared in advance. You're giving the team time to review it. Jeff Bezos, Amazon, books 30 minutes at the start of his meetings for people to read the pre-reads. He just admitted that no one reads the pre-reads before the meeting, so he starts the meeting where everyone reads the pre-reads. They circle and make comments, and then they discuss. That might be helpful for some people on your team. It certainly leads to really efficient meetings. And then I think for the shy people, you just want to moderate, right? You just want to make sure that, hey, or, this person hasn't spoken in a while. Is there anything you want to bring up? Maybe circle back at the end and say, hey, you're a little quiet. Is there anything that, you feel like you want to share with me that I can maybe share with other people? But I would start maybe with like some of the basics of just getting to know what style each of your teammates are, and maybe look at something like a manager README. We've got a good article. I think there's like 49 of them on our website somewhere if you're looking for inspiration.
Lots of examples there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of that too, just building on what you said, is being clear with your team that there are different ways to participate. If you have something to say and you don't feel comfortable speaking up in the meeting, write in the chat. Like, that's only available in remote meetings. And that's a really handy tool for people who are introverted or maybe shy speaking up in meetings. There's actually almost, like you said, is remote bad for introverts? There's almost more tools available to them.
Totally agree. And the downside is like you maybe don't get some of the tools that the office provides. It's harder to build rapport and stuff. And so it's not necessarily harder. Maybe harder is the wrong word. It's definitely more awkward because it feels forced. And so like the second tip I think is maybe lean into some of that awkwardness, right? Like it might be awkward to put an icebreaker at the start of your team meetings and then stick to it, right? Like start your meetings like, all right, guys, before we begin, we're going to do an icebreaker. Maybe you assign someone a role on the team to be the icebreaker person. They bring a different one every single week. Might be awkward to hold true to that every single time you meet. But truthfully, the icebreakers can bring out different stories and sides and learnings to people, and that can start building rapport. And I think that builds comfort, right? So I know we do it internally. It's awkward. We feel weird as we do it every time, but I think when we're done them, we're always like, I'm glad we do this. So I would embrace that awkward.
Next is, how important are methods/models, not tools, for you to break down complexity in leadership/management of engineering teams? Which ones do you use?
I'm a big method model person. You probably can tell by a bunch of the stuff already on our site. Because I think it's just a way to organize. I think organization is really important for being high performing, which is really the goal of, I think, most leadership and management, regardless if it's engineering teams. So as I think about the method and models that are available to us as engineering leaders, I think they fall into two camps. There's the product management methods and models, which help break down the complexity that might be more engineering complexity or project-based complexity. And so like some of the ones that we use that I think are important over there are things like jobs to be done, things like user stories. We operate on sprints. We care about agile. We try to bring customers into the conversation. We try to ship early and often. I think that helps take something that's a never-ending project down into something that you can generate some momentum on. And I think momentum is big in most tech companies. On the other hand, as your team grows and as your responsibility grows and as you have more and more people on your team, I think the specifics and implementations of some of those principles matter a little bit less. And we go into the other type of organizing method and model, which is more people-based. You certainly don't want to manage your people the way that you manage your projects. And you start thinking a little bit more about, okay, well, how do I break down the complexity of my organization? Do I want one team to focus on a metric, or do I want one team to focus on a product area? Do I want one team, right? You start to think about breaking down the complexity that way. And then within that group, this team's going to focus on our activation metrics. I don't really care if they use Jira or they use a Kanban tool or they use this methodology or that methodology. I care more so about the outcome that the team is providing, and is that the right outcome? And so then you start going into, is goals versus OKRs and SMART goals and MBOs, and do you care about directly responsible individuals? Do you care about hybrid reporting structures? I listed a whole bunch, but I think like, there are basics that are kind of true across every team. I think you want one-on-ones for managing your team. You need information to flow up and down the org chart. Seems to be the best way to do it. You're probably going to want some form of demo day type meeting so that people can show off their work, a show and tell type meeting, some town hall type meeting for news. I think you're going to want to put in place some form of sprint planning, some form of quarterly kickoff and a reminder of those top priorities. You're probably going to want to put in OKRs. Those things seem to be consistent no matter the team you jump into. And so I would say that those are important. The tools kind of a little bit less so important. I guess all of that is to say, I think organizing projects and organizing people in teams really is the heart of the job in any engineering function. And so the methods and models in which you organize those, I think, are really important. I don't know if it matters which ones you choose as much as it matters that you choose one and stick to it and you're consistent and the team knows about it.
Any thoughts on a 4-day work week? There's a lot of talk about this.
I have lots of thoughts on it. I'll sum it up maybe in that, like, we have someone on our team who works a 4-day work week. So I guess the general thought is like, I guess I'm fine with it. I think there's a balance, right? I think as a salaried person, if you want to work 4 days a week and get paid for 5 days a week, I think that's unfair for the people who are working 5 days a week to get paid the same rate. So I think there's like some trade-offs there. And I think as long as you're willing for those trade-offs, my guess is a lot of employers would be pretty receptive to it, right? 4-day a week, 2-day a week, whatever, especially for really expensive talent. On the other hand, I do think that there's a lot of people that want to work 5 days a week who can't, right? So I think there's a little bit of like a market dynamic problem that some people want to do it, some people don't want to do it. If you're faced with two people who are equal, which one do you choose from a market? I think that's tough. I know as a consumer, I want stores to be open when I'm ready to shop, right? I want my deliveries to appear next day. So I think if we think about it from the consumer perspective, you think about it, what's the outcome that the customer gets here? I think that allows you to think about the problem a little bit differently. And the first thing I would say is like, maybe we stop thinking about our work week in terms of days, right? Like we trade our time and labor for money. And instead we trade our time and money for outcomes. And I think if the outcome is, hey, people can work 4 days a week and everyone gets their packages in a minute, I think if you're Amazon, you're probably like, that sounds great, right? So I think it's more about like, how can you organize around the outcome? Certainly if you could get, the tasks done in 4 days, I don't think there'd be very many people who would be upset about that. I think it's more about, we've got, in a lot of professions, we're thinking about time. We're thinking about hourly wages. And I think there's sacrifices if you're thinking about hourly wages, you want to go to 4 days a week, there's a sacrifice of 20% of your pay. And I think that's where things get a little convoluted. So if you can get it closer to outcomes, might be able to pull it off. I don't know. Like, 4-day work week would be great for us. I'm sure a lot of people would be really happy about it. Our customers might not be because they reach out to support. So like, okay, well then maybe does support work that day? And then do they feel, it's tough.
Last question is, what are some tools or ways to encourage team members and colleagues to tap into their value?
Yeah, there's ways to interpret this. Like the first thing is like from a tooling perspective, you should go check out Hypercontext. It's great. I think from a resource perspective, like our site, we have resources. We've got a whole bunch of things documented, the largest library of OKR examples. We have a huge library of agenda templates if you want inspiration to have conversations that you otherwise wouldn't have. But I think those are tools available to you. I think as you think about maybe what the heart of this question is, when we're asking for team members to tap into their value, I think what we're saying is, how do we motivate them? How do we get them more engaged? And the way I always interpret that, to just simplify the problem down a little bit more, is, what does engagement mean, especially on a team? And engagement on a team basically means, does your team members, do they show up and do they try? And if they're showing up and they care and they're trying, then you're going to get as much value as you probably can get out of them. So I think exactly the formula needed for each person is going to be slightly different on a person by person level. So like the blanket statement for all these questions is get to know your team really well. The other piece of that, though, is that what is true as an average across every human is that 70% of the variance in an individual's engagement score comes down to their direct manager, right? So 70% of the reason people show up and try hard at work is going to be you as a manager. And so what are the things that you're doing that maybe is discouraging them from trying or discouraging them from showing up and caring? Are there aspects where maybe you're not taking feedback easily? Are there ways where you're maybe not making it easy to share feedback? Is there ways where maybe you're not acting on that feedback in a way that is visible and obvious to your team? Sometimes that can lead to people just saying, I'm not going to bother giving this person the same feedback I've given them 3 times. They're still doing it. They're never going to change. So I think a lot of it is like, turning this conversation inward and saying, what can I do that will unlock more value out of my team members? And so I would explore some of those things. I think readmes are a good way to do it. I think I would dive deep in your one-on-ones. I think be vulnerable. Make sure you're following up with feedback that you're getting. And make sure you're giving feedback. You're not waiting feedback linger and wait too long. You try to frame things as like we problems. And I would look at if you're managing a team member who maybe has more potential than you've seen demonstrated in a bit, maybe think about the goal setting process as a more of a collaborative process. Maybe you can say, listen, I want you to work in these areas, but maybe you can come up with some of the goals and I'll edit them this time. I've always found that involvement in those areas leads to more commitment on it. In some cases, loftier goals, certainly more energy. So I think there's a lot of those little things, but I would really look at the culture that you're creating and really try to find more and new ways to be really self-reflective and critical of your own management style and the environment that you're creating per individual.
That's awesome. Well, that's all the questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for writing in. That was great.